Today's webinar is going to focus on the latest information regarding the Census Bureau's content review process. Some of you may have participated in a webinar this spring on this topic, so you know that the Census Bureau is in the process of reviewing each question on the American Community Survey to make sure that the survey includes only those questions that federal agencies need to accomplish their missions. Today's presentation is going to cover results of the first phase of this project and also next steps. Our presenter today is Gary Chappell. He is project lead for the ACS Content Review at the Census Bureau. And with that, I will try to get this into full screen mode and turn it over to Gary.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark, and hello, and thank you to everyone who has joined us today for the discussion. As Mark said, I'm giving you an update on where we are with the content review since we spoke last time, I believe, in April. Our efforts this time that we've conducted in 2014 on the ACS content review, it builds upon earlier efforts. There have been earlier iterations where we've looked at the content of the American Community Survey, but this time was the most rigorous effort we've ever made. And the bullet points illustrate that we did examine and confirm the value of each ACS question on the form. And that included the legal basis. And it very much included fresh, refreshed, and up-to-date information obtained from a large number of federal agencies who constitute our data users. And everything that we did was predicated on using for the analysis pre-specified criteria, and this criteria was established by the ACS Subcommittee of the Interagency Council on Statistical Policy. It goes by the acronym ICSP. That's a mouthful. I do have another slide on this body, but just to let you know that everything we did was using predetermined criteria. And the bolded statement at the bottom of the slide reemphasizes that all of this is to develop recommendations for content on the ACS that ensures that the survey remains focused on providing the most useful information with the least amount of burden to the American public. I just wanted to touch again on sort of the overall context for doing this and the big chunks of the work. So the scope, again, is really every question and sub-question part that exists on the current 2014 version of the ACS questionnaire. At the rest of the slide, you see the three phases described. Today, I'm really talking about the results from phase one, which, again, are to assess the full survey content and identify any questions for potential removal. And this is saying the 2016 survey year because the life cycle of preparation for any of our survey years backs up approximately 15 months. So literally this month, October of 2014, marks the start of the life cycle to effect changes that would be implemented in the field when we go for the first panel in January of 2016 for the ACS. The phases 2 and 3 here, phase 2 is really going to be about, this is, looking to the future. This is where we're going to be looking at assessing the availability of any other sources that may exist to provide a comparable level and quality of data that we are able to obtain by asking the questions directly on the ACS. There could be the potential for administrative record data sets collected by federal agencies or other federal surveys that are out in the field alongside the ACS. There may be some opportunities to leverage those sources to provide information of a comparable or a realistically comparable level of detail. So we would want to examine that in phase 2. And then in phase 3, we would look at more around the research modifications to questions that still exist on the ACS, but could there be another way to ask those questions, or could there be sub-question parts that are no longer necessary for the administration of federal programs, etc. So we would think of phase 3 around testing content or new approaches to content for the survey. I just wanted to give you a few more facts and figures about, for context on the magnitude of this content review. So the first point is who provided us information. Not very long after our April discussion about the content review, at the end of April, on the 29th of April, we conducted more or less a summit kickoff for all the federal agencies that were known to utilize information off of the ACS. And we had reached out to these agencies ahead of April to contact at the highest level their secretarial counterparts to our Deputy Secretary of Commerce, which is the agency of the government that the Census Bureau resides under, the department of the government that the Census Bureau resides under. And we had established points of contact with these agencies. So I won't read through the entire list here, but you can see it's a large and varied number of agencies that were contacted for input. And so what is that input that we asked for? Well, we requested that the agencies provide us feedback on all 72 survey questions on the ACS. So that constitutes 24 separate housing questions and 48 separate person questions. But then disaggregating even further, if you look at all the question elements in the multi-part questions, that constitutes actually 126 individual survey components that were examined in this review. So at the bottom of the slide, I'm saying that I'm talking about the growth in total known uses. We went into this round of content review understanding that there were a wide variety of uses, but through our efforts and through the federal agency efforts, we were able to document over 300 uses, so almost doubling the widespread use of the ACS that is documented. I wanted to give you a waterfall view of what overall the phase 1 process consists of. And what I was just speaking of is the first box in the waterfall, the initial data gathering. So that was conducted during roughly a 3.5 to 4 month period from April to August. And after we had obtained the information from all of our stakeholder agencies, then we conducted a data analysis, and I have several more slides about this. That led to the ability by the end of August to be able to go forward with initial recommendations. And that more or less brings us to where we are today. As a matter of fact, tomorrow, Halloween no less, we have the issuance of the Federal Register notice, which will communicate about the results that were obtained out of phase 1 of the content review. And that notice, I have more I'll say about that, but that leads to this next box, the public comment period. We have a 60-day public comment period, so essentially through the rest of the calendar year, we will be asking for input from the public and comment regarding, frankly, the ACS overall. Any comments are welcome, but in particular on the candidate questions that are under consideration for removal. And then that leads to the last two boxes, which is all comments are considered. The Census Bureau takes this very seriously and will analyze all public comments and evaluate the results that were obtained out of the content review against what the public record comments are that come back in through the Federal Register process. We will make a final recommendation out of that to the Office of Management and Budget, which sits in authority to make the final determination and make the final decision, is what that means, on whether anything will be changing on the 2016 ACS. Now I want to switch a little bit and talk about the so-called problematic topics. Back in April, again, we were struggling with how to scope and deal with the magnitude of this effort. And we went into it thinking, well, it would be reasonable to look at several topic areas that are known to generate a certain degree of notoriety, if you will, comment from the public, things that Congress might be asking us about on a fairly consistent basis. So we had gone into the content review wanting to look at these 4 target areas that are on the slide. Flush toilets, which is part of a larger topic area of plumbing facilities in housing. Disability, which is a collection of 6 questions, many of you know. Journey to work, which is another collection of about 4 questions on the form. And income, which is 2 questions, but one of them has 7 parts. So this is a very major area of the survey. What we found out of doing the content review, and I realize I haven't walked you through the analysis yet, but just to say this up front for those of you who may remember that we put a strong emphasis on these topic areas, all 4 of these actually ended up scoring very highly on benefit, where many agencies have signaled that they use the information that's collected for these 4 target areas. On the cost side, there is more of a range from high to low here. The first 2 areas really are not that costly to collect. The second 2 areas, journey to work and income, are a higher cost to collect. I will take the moment to say that benefit is characterized in terms of number of uses, whereas cost is characterized not in terms of dollars per se, but in terms of the difficulty or the burden to collect the information. I said I would come back to the ICSP, this interagency Council of Statistical Policy, and just explain that this body was formed a couple of years ago, and you can see in the quote, to provide advice to the Director of the Census Bureau and the Chief Statistician of the Office of Management and Budget on how the ACS can best fulfill its role in the portfolio of federal household surveys and provide the most useful information with the least amount of burden. So our current membership includes, indeed, the Census Bureau Director, John Thompson, and the OMB Chief Statistician, Catherine Wallman. They're the co-chairs. The 3 committee members, subcommittee members rather, are 3 heads. It rotates among 3 heads of statistical agencies. Right now we have Erica Groshin of she is Commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We have Joseph Riley, the Director of the National Agricultural Statistical Service. And we have Charlie Rothwell, who is the Director of the National Center for Health Statistics. And, surrounding this is the notion that the ACS, the fundamental mission, if you will, of the ACS, is that it serves small populations and small geographic areas. So that was very central to our thinking and how we approached the content review. This is getting into the methodology. So our weighting approach really rested on 2 fundamental dimensions. We wanted to look at the geographic levels for the uses of the information on the ACS, and we also wanted to look at the legal basis behind defining those uses and how that explicitly calls for the use, or whether or not it calls for explicitly the use of the ACS or the census to collect that information. So with the geographic levels, we had 3 fundamental levels. The lowest level was the block group or tract level. The middle, if you will, level was the place, county, metropolitan statistical area level. And the upper level was the state, national level. And so these were compared against the degree of legal use. So our monikers here are mandatory, which is signified by an M, required, which is signified by an R, and programmatic, which is signified by a P. The mandatory definitions are on the page. The strongest is the mandatory, where there is indeed a law in the books, and it points to the use of the decennial census or the ACS. Most, if not all of you know that previous to the ACS we had the long-form sample, which is why we reference the decennial census. But both the decennial census and the ACS operate under Title 13, the Census Act, which require that the information on the ACS be a mandatory survey. The next type of legal definition is where there's a federal law or implementing regulation, and it does explicitly require the use of data to help administer the program. And you know, historically, the decennial or the ACS is the source, or the data is needed for case law requirements imposed by the court system. Lastly, we have really those uses that do not have a legal basis. So those are data that are needed for program planning, for administering the program, its implementation or evaluation, but there indeed is no explicit mandate or requirement for collecting that information. So now that we've sort of talked about the weights, let's look at a notional example on the next slide. And as you can see, the 3x3 forms a 9-cell grid. And the approach, the methodological approach, results in a binary result in each of these cells. There either is a use or there is not. And if there is a use, there may be many uses, but it's binary. So if there's one to many uses, you score a 1, or if there are no uses, there's a 0. So this, again, crosses the 3 tiers of geography with the 3 tiers of legal basis to form an approach for examining each question on the survey. 10 and 11 are going to show you there's a lot of information on these slides, and I'm not going to try to give you every detail and overwhelm you, but the slide does depict real information. This is the actual result out of the computation of the methodology. And going across the top of this slide are 9 of the 13 benefit factors. There were, as I say, the ICSP pre-specified the approach we were to use. And in that process of predetermining how we should do this, so that we remain scientific and objective, we wanted everything to be upfront defined before we actually ran the data through it. So they gave us 13 criteria to look at for making decisions on the benefit side. And again, this is all around the uses of the data. So very much the top across from left to right on the slide is kind of showing you the breakout based on those levels of geography, the block group track level, and then the place county MSA, and then the state national. And then within each of those, we've got uses that could be at the mandatory, the M, the R, or the P, for each of those 3 levels of geography. So then you can start to see how these, each question on the form, this is just starting to give you a snapshot of part of the data, and it shows you how housing questions in the second to the left column there, the housing question 1, housing question 2, so on and so forth. You start to see how things computed out. And the color coding here is green is sort of signaling that there was a positive weight given to that benefit, whereas the reds and ambers or yellows, they got less credit for that particular category. So at the bottom of slide 10, we just had the 4 remaining design criteria beyond that constitute the 13 positive ones for benefits. And that had to do with other data sources are available, or coefficients of variation, interquartile ranges, and frame. So other data source has to do with, is the ACS the only thing out there that can be utilized to obtain this information, versus are there other sources? The coefficient of variation has to do with providing us some insight into the quality of the measure, by geography, and this is at the county level. And the interquartile ranges is a similar quality measure, and it provides insight into the amount of variability in the estimate by geography. And then lastly, there is the frame, and this is whether or not the question has any utility in helping frame or form the frame of another federal survey. So moving along, that's the benefit side. So then for the cost side, we had 6 factors, and the first 3 columns here, the interview survey cognitive burden, the interviewer survey sensitivity, and interviewer survey overall difficulty, those 3 all come from the Census Bureau having canvassed its own employees. We have a, sort of an army of people out there day in, day out who are collecting the survey data, our field representatives, as well as in terms of telephone centers, we have contact staff who, out of Hagerstown and Jeffersonville and Tucson, Arizona, we handle quite a number of callbacks on the ACS. And so because these are the folks that are the boots on the ground that really have contact with our respondents, we wanted to include them in the analysis. And so we did a survey of about 1,100 of our own staff, and they told us about how cognitively difficult did they believe each of these questions was for the respondents, and how sensitive, how often do they get a reaction from a respondent that this information is rather sensitive to them. And then in their perception, what are the overall most difficult questions to answer? And then after these 3 of the 6, the remaining 6 cost design criteria factors are the adjusted mean seconds to answer, which comes from our electronic modes. We're able to actually know from paradata how long does a person sit and in responding to a particular internet screen, or when our call center staff do call back, how long do they stay on a particular screen. And similarly, when we have a personal interview, how long does the interviewer on their laptop they take to collect the information on the survey, how long do they spend on that screen? So we were able to pull all that in together and calculate how long it takes for each of these questions. Allocation rates, how frequently data is missing because the respondent simply doesn't provide it and we've not been able to obtain it. That factors into our cost score. And then lastly, how many complaints do we get? And this comes in from emails and correspondence and phone calls. The correspondence includes very controlled congressional, the congressional correspondence that will come in from various congressional districts. So we rolled all of that into this as well, and we end up with a cost score. So moving to slide 12, that kind of visualizes for us what I've been saying, and it kind of boils it down to the essential factors. So rising from the bottom to the top in the green arrow, the benefits are really driven upwards by mandatory uses that come in at any geographic level, or uses that are defined as a required legal basis at any level below the state level, because again, that gets more at the purpose of the survey. And then another driver is the fact that there's no other data source out there. Moving left to right across the screen for the cost arrow, it's really those first 3 factors that are the highest drivers: the cognitive burden, the sensitivity, and the difficulty. And all of this is in relation to what we're going to show you on slide 13. And that's where we did a quadrant analysis. We generated a scatter plot, and that constituted really the ability to look at the questions on the survey in terms of, a direct 50-point 100-point scale on the benefit side, and going across the x-axis, the 100-point scale for cost. And to remain as direct and objective as we could, we bisected in both directions, and we created 4 equal quadrants into which questions could fall as a result of the analysis. And so we have the 4 quadrants here. The first one in the upper left is really the sweet spot for a survey. It's where you are collecting high benefit questions, you're answering those, and you have low cost to get the information. So the good news for the ACS is that over 50% of the questions of the 72 on the survey, 54% fall into this quadrant. Moving over to the right-hand upper side, you see quadrant 2, which is also high benefit, so we're still above the 50-point line. And those are high benefit as well, but these are the ones that do cost us more in terms of burden to get the information collected. And about a quarter, 26% of the survey questions fell here. Now to go and look at the beneath the line, we have those questions that are low benefit. On the lower left quadrant is quadrant 3. So those are the low benefit and low cost. They're not that many uses out there, but relatively speaking, they're not that costly to collect. That's about 17% of the survey questions. And then lastly, if you will, the worst quadrant to be in, which is the low benefit, but it costs a lot, the high cost. Fortunately, only 3% of the survey questions fell here. So now the next slide is basically the big reveal. How did it turn out? So this was our scatter plot after we ran all the questions through all of the weighted factors. And in the big picture, you can see in terms of using the legend in the lower right, you can see that the green diamonds represent questions that had a mandatory legal basis to them. They clearly are mostly in the upper quadrants. Then you can look at the blue circles, and those are questions that have a required legal basis. And again, these are at any geographic level at this stage. And anything that would have a triangle, and the sharp-eyed people out there will notice that we only have one yellow triangle, which we'll talk about in a minute. That is any question that has programmatic uses, but nothing beyond in terms of a higher legal basis for those questions. And then the red square is if there are no uses associated with that question. So for the next sequence of slides, starting with 15, I am only going to be zoomed in and looking at the quadrants that were below the 50-point line for benefit. So that's quadrants 3 and 4. And then we're going to zoom in on questions that are candidates for removal. So here we haven't done anything to take anything off the slide. This is just having zoomed in on quadrants 3 and 4. So we're beginning with the full array of the mandatory, the required, the programmatic uses, and an X for any question that did not have a use. If we go to slide 16, you can see that what happens if we exclude from consideration for removal any questions that had a mandatory or legal basis or a law behind them. This is not to say that forevermore we would never look at a question that had a legal basis, because laws can change. They're the will of the people, so laws change all the time. But for the present moment, anything that we're required to collect because it's a legal mandate, we're not going to look at that right now. So if we go to slide 17, then we can see, well, okay, now let's take away anything that was excluded. We're going to exclude from consideration from removal anything that was a required legal basis with a sub-state use. So anything that's at the place, county, MSA, or the block, group, tract, that would still be present, but we are going to, would be excluded, but anything that only had a state or national level use would still be present. And then, so now we're at the very conclusion of what we have come up with in terms of results from the analysis. So slide 18 is the result of the content review. And you can see here that everything on this page, these are the 7 questions on the 2014 ACS that are right now candidates for removal from the survey. So let me just step through these. The first one is, you probably were wondering about this one. This is housing question 6. This is a business or a medical office exists on the property. And we had no one respond with having a use for this particular question. So unless you're doing some sort of comparable examination back to previous censuses, there really is nothing that subject matter experts at the Census Bureau were aware of that, this could be used for, and certainly no external agencies indicated that. So moving down to the next question, this is a question where there are no mandatory and there are no required uses. So there is a programmatic use or uses, but none that rise to the level of mandatory or required. And that's person question 12, and that is the undergraduate field of degree. It's not what degree, not what level of degree, what level of education you received, but what is your field of degree. Right now, what we know of is the National Science Foundation uses this question to target its sampling frame for its own survey, the National Survey of College Graduates. And it also supports STEM migration analyses. To the right-hand side, you see other agencies, and all of these agencies also had programmatic uses. So you see the set of 246, that's 6 agencies that also reported some programmatic uses. And then at the bottom of the slide is the remainder, the 5 remaining questions. These are questions that had no mandatory and had no required use at the low levels of geography, meaning the block group tract or the place county MSA levels. And you can see that these all have to do with the marital history. This is not, again, question 20 on marital status. These are the marital history questions. The get married, get widowed, get divorced, times married, and last year married. The one agency that had a required use at the national state level was the Social Security Administration. They use that for cost projecting, for their actuarial targeting, for their benefits payouts. And then the other agencies along the far right are other agencies that have also supplied us with programmatic uses. So that's a lot of information I just gave you. If we go to slide 19, it's a little less dense with facts and figures, but probably is on your mind. How to contact us about the results of the survey and or the analysis. And the next slide we'll talk about what the next steps are. But before I leave this page, we do have a web page devoted to the content review, which we are periodically updating. And we will be updating in the next day or two with the link to the Federal Register notice, which is coming out tomorrow, which is at the bottom of the slide here. But before I get to the Federal Register notice, I just want to say, if you want, background information and frequently asked questions, and there's a variety of materials there where you can consult to understand more about the content review, including, it's not up there yet, but very soon we're going to have the final project documentation posted. I believe we're going to post it to this link, and we can certainly send you more information about that. But we do plan at this stage to post our final suite of documentation, which will constitute a summary report, and then you'll get a series of very detailed reports describing each of the analysis factors, the data streams that fed into the process. And then the second bullet on the page is, if you haven't already signed up for GovDelivery ACS notifications, please do so, because that's one of our major mechanisms for keeping you informed on recent events and current events on what's going on with the ACS, including the content review. So tomorrow, this leads to the Federal Register notice. We will be sending out a notification on the actual posted link on the Federal Register website of the Federal Register notice itself. This is a 60-day notice, and we just received word yesterday that it's going to go live tomorrow and be live for 60 days. I may have the last, should have said December 30th there. I think if I count 60 days, it's actually December 30th. But suffice to say that it's for a full 60-day period to allow for a healthy period for people to reflect and think about this and talk to their constituents, talk to their stakeholders who they feel strongly about the ACS, and go on the public record. I'm encouraging you to do this. Go on the public record to register your comments. And this certainly doesn't have to be just about the 7 items. I mean, it can be about anything to do with the content of the ACS. If you wanted to, come out strongly in favor of content that's on the form, you are certainly welcome to do that, or criticize, or whatever form of comment you want to make. We encourage that. So the link will be posted on the content review webpage at the top of the slide as well, to ensure that everyone gets the word on the result of the content review. Now is the time to rally the troops, so to speak, to respond in favor, or whatever means, method, opinion you have about the results of the content review. We do have the tools that I'd mentioned just on the last slide. I don't mean to keep repeating myself, but the content review webpage and the method that we have for making sure we go cast a wide net as the subscriber notices on ACS. So with that, let's keep the dialogue going, and let's open it. The last slide is the question slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. I have one question before I pull up the questions that have come in here, which is you've obviously gathered a lot of information from various agency uses of the ACS, and I wondered how you would go about weighting the public comments that you receive through the Federal Register notice versus all of the programmatic agency uses that you've already collected.
Yeah, that's a very good and important question for you to raise, Mark. We aren't doing this in a vacuum, obviously, and excuse me, we will be going back once we've parsed through what's come in the door and we've analyzed it and looked at it. We will have a whole series of dialogues after that to have conversations back out with certainly the ICSP Subcommittee on ACS that I referred to, the Office of Management and Budget, federal agency contacts. And I didn't really speak a whole lot about this, but we also collected, as we went along, we posted, and some of you may very well have been respondents to this. We had, for 6 weeks in July, we had a form on our website, the Data User Feedback Form. And we were looking to get a feel for what are the most important elements of the ACS to data users. And we allowed open text fields for people to describe their uses, etc. And we received about 1,000 responses to that, and that certainly has been an important aspect of examining the import of the ACS, because while the federal agencies are first and foremost, and they're the ones that have the legal mandate to utilize the ACS to distribute over $400 billion is usually the figure we quote in federal funding, you know, every one of those agencies obviously is serving the public, so the public stakeholders that this cascades down to, we want to make sure that their voice is heard as well. So we anticipate that a large number of direct data users at the local and tribal government levels, for example, nonprofits, academia, you name it, will be able to will be motivated to respond to us. And during this process, we've tried to get a feel to help us frame an understanding of what comments and how they will be, how we need to deal with them when they come in. So, so we do intend to have very much a conversation with, you know, our federal partners and the stakeholders that they represent before we form our final recommendation on this. Another point is that we have a National Advisory Committee to the Census Bureau, and over the summer we also collected feedback from a special working group that they formed for us. And over a 6-week period, they examined all the questions by topic area as well, and they were able to provide us additionally some perspective on the questions that was outside the direct context of, you know, the federal agencies. Lastly, I would say that 2 years ago there was a conference held by the National Academy of Sciences that was looking for the benefits and costs associated with the ACS, and we've incorporated feedback that was received through that pretty well attended conference, and included that as part of the qualitative information that we've collected that serves to give us better context around the very quantitative process that we followed in the data analysis.
Okay, thanks. There's a question about given congressional concern about specific questions on the ACS, and I know you mentioned some of those, would it make more sense for Phase 2 work, Phase 3 work to come before Phase 2? And then a follow-up question, what is the timing for Phase 2 and 3?
Well, in terms of Phases 2 and 3, Phase 2 being more the examination of are there other sources, alternative sources, and Phase 3 being modifying the way we ask the questions. I'll just, in general, say it that way. I don't want to leave the impression that it's completely in the to be figured out, because we do, alongside this actual content review, alongside it, we do have a process for testing new content, cognitive testing and focus groups to help us formulate the way we would ask questions in future iterations of the ACS. So you're right in a sense that some of what's in Phase 3, Phase 2 and 3 are not necessarily one after the other. They may indeed be, maybe that's more what you're asking, and they could occur in parallel. And we do have a content testing process underway as we speak. If we do hope to align, to the extent possible, any learnings out of the content review into the ongoing cognitive testing process that we have. The second part of your question, I think, was give me a time frame. That's harder for me to do. We operate under the program is doesn't have, you know, endless resources, and we really need to focus our research agenda, and we're in the midst of doing that. And so in the next several years, we hope to be embarking on research, lines of research having to do with adjustments we could make to the survey to improve it and reduce burden, you know, starting in the current fiscal year and on into fiscal 16. Most of you, or some of you, may know that every decennial census cycle, in the year ending in 7, we have to inform Congress of the topics that we will include on the ACS, and in the year ending in 8, we have to actually provide them the specific questions that we will have on the ACS. So it, we have to be mindful of that schedule as well. So there are some constraints and boundaries we work within, but we will be embarking on a research agenda that includes some of these ideas in the, immediately, starting this fiscal year.
Okay, good. There are a couple people who wondered if they'd be able to access these slides. I'm presuming that these are pretty similar to the slides that you gave at the National Advisory Committee recently. Is that right?
Yes. In fact, I believe we will just simply make these available for posting through your webinar site.
Yes.
Is that correct, Mark?
We'd be happy to post it on our website along with the recording, the actual recording of the webinar, which will be available at www.acsdatausers, all one word, .org. So we can try to do that as soon as possible, so people will have it available as they review the Federal Register.
And again, for further background, anyone is more than welcome to visit our website, which is the URL is on the slide deck that you're posting. And I didn't really go into the detail, but the Federal Register notice itself will in fact have a link back to the content review webpage on the ACS website at Census Bureau. And it is going to enable anyone who comes to visit the site to see some additional materials that give you a better understanding. There's a 200-page document that lists by topic area and by agency each of the uses with its justification. So I think it'll give you a more clear understanding of the magnitude and the the penetration of the ACS throughout the federal statistical system. I mean, it's really quite amazing how intertwined ACS is with so many major federal programs.
Okay. You mentioned some questions that were high benefit, high cost towards the beginning of your presentation. Someone asked if those are still being considered for removal, or is it only the low benefit questions? And then as a follow-up question to that, will the ratings for all of the questions in the ACS, because presumably you've classified all of them, would people be able to get that information in the broader report that you're putting together?
To answer that question first, yes, we will be publishing that. And the question that was asked about the high benefit, high cost questions, would they, or ones of interest to Congress, what are we to do with that? I mean, that is such a good question. I mean, that always is on the radar. I mean, the ACS, the environment in which the ACS is conducted is, has become more challenging in recent years, and with so much of the public concerned about identity theft and concerns over sharing information on the internet and et cetera, and so on and so forth, we still get an extraordinarily high, I believe it's up around 97% response rate for the ACS. Of course, that it's mandatory is a strong reason for that. But we always are anticipating, the environment these days is that we always have to anticipate that there could be challenges to the very nature of the ACS. I mean, fundamentally, that we are taking the ACS is something that comes before Congress and bills with some degree of frequency. And, if not challenges to collecting the information in general, the fact that the survey is mandatory, that is challenged as well. So we always want to be responsive to Congress, and we want to be sure that we are taking efforts that demonstrate that we take it seriously, that we must always be extraordinarily mindful of the degree of burden that we impose on the public to collect this very necessary information. And, as I sort of alluded to earlier, the will of the people may change over time as expressed through laws. So we are constantly in a position to remain open and flexible to changes to the survey that could perhaps lead to burdens. I didn't really talk about, all the strategies that have come to mind in undergoing this process, but for example, is there potentially in the future a way to only ask some of these questions periodically, or maybe ask it of subsets of the population? There's just a variety of approaches that conceivably could be tapped to make the survey even more nimble and appropriate, given that we have so many challenges to being mindful of the burden and always being very visible, even as it's a public good that can be interpreted in many ways. So we definitely want to ensure that we're being very responsive to the public and to Congress.
Great. Well, there aren't any other specific questions that have come in, but Gary, you did mention that the Federal Register notice should be out tomorrow, and I wanted to let people know that because we're going to be sending you all a link to the recording of the webinar anyway, I think that we should be able to include the link to that notice in that email that you'll receive in the next day or two. So is that right, Gary? You're expecting that on Friday?
Yeah, if everything goes to plan, we hope to get out the communication about the specific link to the actual Federal Register notice within the Federal Register website tomorrow.
Okay, great. Well, with that, I want to thank Gary for a great presentation. We're looking forward to hearing more about all this work and the next phases of the project in the coming months. So that concludes today's webinar. I want to thank everyone for participating.